Here's something I find quite funny about the world of Game of Thrones. Nobody in it actually knows all of its own history. The oldest events get dated with a shrug, and the phrase about 8,000 years ago, which is the historical equivalent of saying, ages back, mate. Every account was written by somebody with a stake in it. The Andals wrote the first proper histories in the south, and funnily enough, the Andals come out of those histories looking marvellous. So tonight, I want to walk through the parts of that world the songs skip over. Not the battles you already know, beat for beat. The cursed castles, the institutions built on cruelty, the places people quietly avoid, and the old horrors everyone has agreed to stop asking about. This covers the show, House of the Dragon, and the deeper written history behind both. Roughly 300 years of Targaryen rule, and a great deal of what came before it. If you enjoy this sort of thing, subscribing helps me out a lot. Right, I want to start with a castle, because there's one in the Riverlands that might be the unluckiest building in fiction. The thing you have to understand about Harrenhal first is the scale, because everything else about it follows from the scale. It was built by a man called Harren the Black, king of the Iron Islands, at a point in history when the Ironborn held not just their own islands, but the entire Riverlands, coast to coast, from the neck down to the Blackwater. Harren wanted a seat that announced what he was, so he picked the north shore of the God's Eye, an enormous lake in the middle of the continent, and he spent decades building the largest fortress anyone in Westeros had ever seen. He didn't pay for it in the normal sense. The labour came from the conquered rivermen, who were made to quarry and haul and stack the stone for the castle that would be used to hold them down, which is a special kind of insult when you think about it. You're not just being ruled, you're being handed the bricks. The finished thing was genuinely enormous. 5 towers, each one named after something Harren was pleased with himself about, all of them taller than anything else standing in the 7 kingdoms. The curtain walls were thick enough that no army with ladders and rams and patience was ever going to get through them. As a piece of pure ground defence, it was, by every measure available at the time, unbeatable. And here's the detail that always gets me. Construction finished the very same day the Targaryens landed on the east coast to begin the conquest. The same day. Harren spent most of his adult life on this thing, moved into it, presumably had a very good evening. And while he was doing that, a man with 3 dragons was pulling his ships up onto a beach a few hundred miles away. Aegon marched west. The rivermen, sensing an opportunity, rose up against Harren and joined the invader, led by Edmund Tully of River Run. Harren shut himself inside his impregnable fortress and refused to surrender, which under normal rules was a perfectly sound decision. He had walls nobody could break and food for a siege. Aegon didn't besiege it. He flew Balerion over the walls and set the whole castle on fire from above. Harren and all his sons burned to death inside the tower he'd named after himself. House Hoare ended that night, entirely, in about the time it takes to watch a film. And the fire was hot enough that the stone itself softened and ran, so parts of Harrenhal are still standing today as slumped, warped, half-melted rock. It never got properly rebuilt. 300 years later, it's still a ruin with people living in bits of it. Now that's the founding. What happened afterwards is the part that gave the place its reputation. Aegon handed the castle to Sir Quentin Coherys, his old master-at-arms. Coherys fell off a horse and died. His line went out within a couple of generations. It passed to House Harroway, who lost it in a mess of drownings and executions. Then House Strong, who we'll get to in a moment because they're the best of the lot. Then House Lothston, who are remembered mainly for going spectacularly mad. Then the Wents, who threw one famous tournament and then quietly ceased to exist during the war. Then Janos Slynt, briefly, who was sent to the wall and had his head taken off in the snow. Then Littlefinger, who did visit Harrenhal and came to a fairly definitive end at Winterfell. Not one of them died old and comfortable in their bed. Every single family handed Harrenhal has been wiped out or ruined. The strong business is worth sitting with. In House of the Dragon, when Daemon takes the castle, The Castellan is an elderly man called Simon Strong, who bends the knee within about 90 seconds and then cheerfully rubbishes his own great-nephew over dinner. He calls Larys Strong a curse on the family. He's right. Larys had his own father and brother burned alive in their beds to inherit the place, and Simon makes a point of noting that it was the first fire Harrenhal had suffered since Aegon set it alight, which is a rather chilling way to keep score. And then there's Daemon's stay there, which is one of my favourite bits of the whole show. He takes the castle almost too easily, gets suspicious, refuses to eat, and then starts having a very bad time. Something hammers on his door in the night, and there's nobody there. He follows the sound of a woman humming and finds a vision of Rhaenyra as a girl, calmly sewing a child's head back onto its shoulders, telling him off for making messes she has to clean up. He wakes up standing in front of the heart tree in the Godswood with no memory of walking there, and a dark-haired woman he'd half noticed in the hall earlier tells him flatly that he's going to die at Harrenhal. Rhaenyra, elsewhere in the show, says outright that she believes in the curse. Daemon calls it superstition. I think the honest answer is somewhere in the middle and slightly less supernatural than either of them wants. Because here's the practical version. Harrenhal is too big. That's it. That's the curse. A castle that size needs a garrison of thousands to man the walls and an income to match, and there isn't a lord in the Riverlands who can generate that kind of money from the surrounding land. So whoever holds it pours everything they have into a building that gives nothing back, rattles around inside a half-ruined shell with a few hundred men, and goes broke or gets picked off. Its greatest strength is exactly why nobody can hold it. Both explanations are probably true at once, which is very much how that world works. A small detail I like. The Wents who held it before the war threw the great tourney at Harrenhal in the year of the false spring. That's the tournament where Rhaegar won and then rode past his own wife to crown Lyanna Stark Queen of Love and Beauty, where Aerys named Jaime to the Kingsguard purely to spite Tywin, and where a fair number of the people who'd spend the next few years killing each other were all in the same field, eating the same food, being perfectly civil. Everything that broke the realm was standing in the shadow of that castle for a fortnight, and a generation later Arya Stark was pouring wine in the same hall for the man who'd sacked her family's capital, having walked past courtyards stacked with bodies to get there. For a ruin nobody wants, it does keep turning up at the worst possible moments. Harrenhal is also where the war in the Riverlands actually lived. Whoever holds it holds the crossing of the continent, so it changed hands constantly during the War of the Five Kings, Lannisters, then Northmen, then Lannisters again, then the Brotherhood, then Bolton men, and each time the new occupants found the previous occupants' work still lying about the courtyard. Robb took it and got nothing for it. Tywin had already pulled out and left him a ruin with 200 bodies in it, which is a fairly pointed way of saying, you're welcome to it. Since we're already on the subject of places that got burned into glass, let's go east. Valyria started as a nation of shepherds. That's the version the histories give anyway, and I quite like that it's such a boring origin for the most powerful civilization the world ever produced. Shepherds on a peninsula near a chain of volcanoes called the 14 Flames. At some point they found dragons in the mountains, or the dragons found them, and everything changed. What the Valyrians built on the back of that was an empire that stretched across most of a continent and lasted 5,000 years. They conquered the old Giscari Empire 5 separate times, which tells you something about both parties. They ruled most of the free cities, or rather they founded them as colonies. They took slaves from everywhere and sent them home. And the slavery is the foundation of the whole thing, not a side effect of it. The volcanoes weren't just scenery. The 14 Flames were volcanoes with deep mines beneath them, and the mines were worked by enslaved people in shafts cut into active volcanic rock. Nobody kept account of how many died down there, because nobody was counting. The Empire's wealth came out of holes in the ground that killed the people digging them. On top of that, they had sorcery, and they used it the way we use concrete. Valyrian roads are still there, centuries after the Empire ended, and thousands of years after the roads were laid. They don't crack, they don't subside. The stone was fused by something nobody now knows how to do, and every road built since has been worse. There are structures in the old Valyrian style, with no visible joints anywhere in them, as if the whole thing was poured. Blood magic gets mentioned a lot in connection with this, usually by people who are uneasy about it. Whatever the method, it worked, and it hasn't been reproduced. The Dragonlord families married brother to sister as a matter of policy. Not scandal policy. The reasoning was that the bond with dragons ran in the blood, and diluting the blood would lose it. So you kept it in the family, generation after generation. 40 families at the height of it, all doing this, all with dragons. Then one day, it all stopped. The doom of Valyria happened in a single day. The 14 flames erupted together. The peninsula shattered. The sea came in through the cracks. Nearly every one of those 40 Dragonlord families died, along with their dragons, along with the city, along with essentially the entire concentration of magical and political power in the known world. Nobody has ever established what caused it. That's not a gap in the record that got filled in later. That's a gap that is still open. There are theories, obviously, mostly involving the mines going too deep or the sorcery going wrong, and none of them can be checked because everyone who might have known was standing on the peninsula at the time. One Dragonlord family survived. House Targaryen, a fairly minor Dragonlord family, not one of the great ones, who had moved to a rock off the coast of Westeros 12 years earlier because a daughter of the house had a dream about the end of the world, and her father decided to take it seriously. That's the entire chain of custody for dragons in the world afterwards. One prophetic dream and one household that packed up in time. What's left of the homeland lies in the smoking sea, and people don't go there. Ships that sail in mostly don't sail back out. The water is described as boiling in places, the sky's wrong, and there's a superstition among sailors that the demons of Valyria still hold the place. Whether that's demons or just a geologically unstable region full of poison gas is a question I don't think anybody has been keen to resolve personally. There is one thing living in the ruins, though: the stone men. Greyscale is a disease that turns living flesh to grey, cracked, stiffened stone, working inwards from the extremities. In children caught early, it sometimes stops and leaves scarring, which is what happened to Shireen Baratheon. In adults, it doesn't stop. It takes the body slowly, and it takes the mind along the way, and the end result is something that is not really a person anymore, and is violently dangerous to touch. Those afflicted get exiled, and a great many of them get exiled to the ruins of old Valyria, which means the wonder of the ancient world is now functionally a leper colony that nobody supervises. Sailing past it at close range is considered a stupid thing to do, and in the show, when Tyrion and Jorah drift through the ruins on a small boat, it goes exactly as badly as you'd expect. The other half of the Doom's legacy is what happened everywhere else. With Valyria gone, the colonies broke away and immediately went for each other's throats. That period is called the Century of Blood, or the Blood Century, and it's 100 years of constant war between the newly independent free cities. Worse, without dragons in the sky, there was nothing holding the Dothraki in place. They came out of the Central Plains in an enormous first wave and sacked cities more or less at will across the continent. That only stopped at the Battle of Qohor, where 3,000 Unsullied held Qohor against a Khalasar many times their size, and after that the raids continued, but never at the same scale. Volantis, the oldest and proudest of the free cities, spent the tail end of that century trying to reconquer everything and put the empire back together under itself. It failed. And then, roughly, as all that was settling down, a Targaryen on a rock off the coast of Westeros, looked west and decided he fancied a continent. There's a coda to Valyria that I think gets overlooked, which is what it did to language. High Valyrian is dead as a spoken tongue. It survives the way Latin survives here, as the thing educated people learn to show they're educated, and the thing you say ritual phrases in. Vala Morgulis, Vala Doheris. Meanwhile, every one of the old colonies drifted off into its own bastardized dialect. So a merchant from Bravos and a merchant from Volantis can technically both claim to be speaking Valyrian at each other and understand roughly half of it. An empire dies and leaves behind roads nobody can copy, a language nobody speaks properly, and a stretch of sea nobody will sail. That's a fairly complete haunting, and the dragons themselves are part of this, because Valyria's collapse is also the story of a species. Dragons were not native to the peninsula in any simple sense. The Valyrians found them, or the histories say so, and bonded to them through methods they never wrote down for outsiders. 40 families, hundreds of dragons, and a common understanding that a dragon has no master, only a rider it tolerates. All of that knowledge went into the Doom with everybody who held it. What the Targaryens took west was a handful of animals and whatever their own household happened to remember, which is why so much of what came afterwards was people guessing. Nobody in Westeros ever really knew how any of it worked. They just had 3 dragons and a great deal of confidence. Now let's talk a bit about the tokar. The tokar is the garment worn by the ruling class in the cities of Slavers Bay. It's a long, trailing fringe thing that wraps around the body and drapes over one arm. And the crucial feature of it is that it's impossible to wear and do anything at the same time. You have to hold it up with one hand permanently, or you'll trip over it, walk too fast and it can unravel, or send you sprawling. That's deliberate. The whole point of the tokar is that it announces you have never done a day's work and never will, because other people do all of it for you. It's a status symbol built entirely out of inconvenience. There's something so perfectly smug about it that I find it genuinely funny in a grim way. The cities themselves, Astapor, Yunkai, Marine, and New Geese across the water, sit on the bones of the Giscari Empire, which was the great power of the world before Valyria turned up. The Valyrians beat them 5 times, and after the 5th war, they salted the fields, burned the cities, and outlawed the language. So the modern lot boast constantly about their ancient Giscari heritage, while speaking a dialect of Valyrian, with about as much genuine continuity as a theme pub has with medieval England. What they do have is the slave trade, and they run it for the entire known world. The most famous product is the Unsullied, and I want to go through how they're made, because it's laid out plainly in the show, and it's worse than most people remember. Boys are bought at around 5 years old. From that point they're trained constantly, and roughly 1 in 4 survives the training. Not 1 in 4 fails, 1 in 4 survives. They're taught to feel nothing about pain, and the demonstration Krasnus gives Daenerys is to slice the nipple off one of his soldiers, who doesn't flinch and then thanks him for the privilege. Every morning, each of them draws a new name from a barrel. Grey Worm, Red Flea, Black Rat. The names are all vermin, deliberately, and they change daily so that no man ever holds on to one, long enough for it to mean anything. And the final test at the end of the training is that each of them is given a coin, sent to the slave markets, told to buy a newborn baby, and made to kill it in front of its mother. The masters pay the mother compensation for the child afterwards. That detail, the compensation, is the one that sits with me. Somebody worked out a price. Yunkai up the coast specialises in a different product. The Yunkish train bed slaves, rather than soldiers, in the various arts, and they're extremely pleased with the sophistication of it. Marine has the fighting pits, which are exactly what they sound like, and which the Meereenese nobility describe as culture. The people caught up in all this come from everywhere. Slavers raid across the summer sea and take captives from Sothorios, from Nath, from the Summer Isles. They take them by piracy from the free cities, which is why you'll find blonde, blue-eyed slaves from Lys standing next to people whose families were taken from the far south. Missandei was taken from Nath. Grey Worm was taken from the Summer Isles. Neither of them was born anywhere near Astapor. The result is that the enslaved population of these cities is more genuinely mixed than the Masters are, though the Masters are hardly a single people either, since losing a war has historically been enough to put an aristocratic Giscari family into chains alongside everyone else. Then there's the road to Meereen. When Daenerys marched on the city, the Great Masters sent a message ahead. They took 163 slave children, and they nailed one to a signpost at every mile of the road, arms pointing the way to Meereen, and left them there. The intent was to make her walk past every single one of them on the way in. She did, and when she took the city, she had 163 of the Masters nailed up in exactly the same way. I go back and forth on that moment. In the scene, it lands as justice, and there's a satisfaction to it that the show absolutely wants you to feel. But Ser Barristan is standing right there saying, more or less, that sometimes it's better to answer injustice with mercy. And he's not wrong either. The Masters she crucified were chosen by count, not by evidence. Some of them will have deserved it exactly. Some of them almost certainly didn't, in the specific. And what came out of it was the Sons of the Harpy, masked men killing freedmen and soldiers in the streets at night, funded by the wealth that a slave economy leaves lying about, even after you've abolished the slavery. That's the part that never gets planned for. You can end an institution in an afternoon with an army. You cannot end the several thousand very rich people who liked it, and they will still be there in the morning, and they will be extremely annoyed. The fighting pits deserve one more look, because there's a detail there that tells you the most about how these cities think of themselves. When Daenerys shuts the fighting pits down, the objection she gets isn't from the fighters. It's from the nobility, and the argument they make is cultural. The pits are tradition. The pits are what makes Meereen Meereen. Hisdar Zolorak puts it to her as a matter of heritage, and he's sincere about it. His family have been running that heritage for centuries, and the free fighters do actually turn up asking for the pits back, because fighting is the only trade they have, and a man with one skill and no employer is in trouble regardless of how free he is. That's the bit that has stayed with me. Abolishing something is a single decision. Everything downstream of it is somebody's livelihood, somebody's identity, and somebody's grandfather's business. None of which makes the pits any less monstrous. It just means the monstrous thing had roots going all the way down, and pulling it up took half the soil with it. One more Slavers' Bay institution before we move on, because it's the strangest of them. The harpy is the symbol of the whole region, a woman's body with bat wings and eagle's claws holding a chain. Not a sword, a chain. Every city in the bay uses some version of her, and the great bronze harpy on top of the Great Pyramid of Meereen looked down over the market where people were sold for centuries. When Daenerys took the city, she had it pulled down, and the men who started murdering freedmen in the night named themselves after it anyway, because you can take a statue off a roof considerably faster than you can take an idea out of a city. Slavery is illegal in Westeros, by the way. Has been for a very long time. The Iron Islands treat that the way some people treat a speed limit. Let's start with their religion, because it explains a fair bit about them. The Ironborn worship the drowned god, and the central rite of that faith is that a priest holds you under seawater until you stop breathing, and then brings you back. Not symbolically, actually. The prayer is, what is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. And the theology is that a man who has drowned and returned is beyond fear, because the worst thing has already happened to him. Aeron Greyjoy, the damp hair, does this professionally. It doesn't always work, is the thing. People do occasionally just drown. That's considered acceptable. The islands themselves are grim in a very practical way. Thin soil, hardly any timber, poor farmland, cold wet rock in the middle of a rough sea. There is nothing there worth having. And their entire culture is an elaborate philosophical justification of the fact that if they want anything nice, they have to go and take it off somebody else. That's what the old way is. You don't buy things, you take them. Paying the iron price means you killed the man who owned the thing you're now holding. Paying the gold price, with money like a normal person is considered a bit embarrassing. Balon Greyjoy says it out loud in the show, "We do not sow," which is a fantastic line, and also a slightly hollow one, because somebody has to sow. The Ironborn answer to that is thralls. Thralls are people taken in raids and put to work, and the Ironborn will tell you at length that thralls are absolutely not slaves, because a thrall's children are born free, and a thrall cannot be bought or sold. The distinction matters enormously to them. I suspect it matters somewhat less to the man who was dragged off a beach in the stony shore and now spends his life in a mine. The other half of it is salt wives. A man takes a woman in a raid and she becomes his salt wife, alongside whatever rock wife he already had at home, and the arrangement is entirely legal under their customs and entirely a kidnapping under everyone else's. There was a time when this worked at scale. The Ironborn once held the whole Riverlands, which is the reason Harrenhal exists at all. You'll remember whose vanity project that was. But they got pushed back onto their rocks, and they've never really accepted it. Balon rebelled against Robert Baratheon, lost, watched 2 of his sons die, and had his last one taken as a hostage. Then he did essentially the same thing again a decade later during the War of the Five Kings, sending his ships against the north on the grounds that the north was busy. Robb Stark had actually offered him a crown and an alliance. Balon turned it down to raid fishing villages. There's a stubbornness there that's almost admirable if you squint, and is mostly just a man being extremely bad at politics. And then there's Euron, who is a different sort of thing entirely. The Kingsmoot is the Ironborn's one genuinely interesting political institution, an actual election, with captains gathered on the shore, which is more democracy than anywhere else in Westeros manages. Euron turns up to it having recently thrown his own brother off a bridge, says so more or less openly, and gets elected on the strength of it. He tells the assembly that Balon was a bad king who lost 2 wars, which is true, and that he murdered him, which is also true, and the response is a shrug and a coronation. The show's Euron is a fairly straightforward, swaggering pirate. The version in the books is stranger and worse. His ship is called the Silence, and the crew all have their tongues cut out, so that a vessel full of men sails in complete quiet. He collects sorcerers. He's been places nobody sensible goes. Most of that isn't in the show, mind you, but it colours how a lot of readers hear his scenes. There's one Ironborn tradition I do find genuinely appealing, mind you, and it's the finger dance. It involves throwing hand axes at each other and catching them, and the name comes from what happens when you're not very good at it. Men have lost most of a hand to it, and still describe the evening fondly. It's the only Ironborn custom I've come across that seems to be for its own sake, rather than a justification for robbery. The drowned god's opposite number is worth a mention too. The storm god lives in the sky and hates the Ironborn, and every gale and every drowned crewman is understood as part of an ongoing feud between the two. So a fisherman lost in bad weather isn't a fisherman lost in bad weather. He's a casualty in a war between the sea and the air. I have a soft spot for religions that explain the weather by insisting it's personal. What strikes me about the Ironborn overall is that they're the only culture in Westeros whose entire identity is a coping mechanism. They live somewhere with nothing, so they've built a religion, and a legal system, and a set of songs around the idea that having nothing and taking things is morally superior to growing things, and they genuinely believe it. Theon spends most of his story trying to get people who believe that to like him, which was never going to end well. There's a nice bit of irony in how the Ironborn actually get treated by the rest of Westeros too. Everyone finds them appalling and everyone deals with them anyway. Robert put down Baelin's rebellion and then let him keep his islands and his title, because conquering the place properly would have cost more than the place is worth. Which is, functionally, the same logic the Night's Watch applies to certain useful monsters, and we'll get to that later on. The islands survive because nobody thinks they're worth the trouble of ending. There's an entire foreign policy in that. Volantis is the useful comparison here, since it's the free city that kept the old practice going most openly, and it's a useful contrast. In Volantis, the slaves outnumber the free by roughly 5-1, and every one of them is tattooed on the face according to their function. A fly for a servant, a wheel for a driver, a tear for a bed slave. You cannot hide what you are or run without being read at a glance. It's a system built by people who thought about it very carefully. And the ruling class there call themselves Old Blood and trace their descent to Valyria and marry accordingly, which does rather bring us back round to where we started this evening. And that brings us north, from people who take by sea to a family who take by knife. Every great house in Westeros has a sigil. Direwolves, lions, stags, roses, fish, krakens, animals mostly, or plants. House Bolton's sigil is a flayed man, a red figure with its skin off, hanging upside down so its flayed skin forms a white X-shaped cross on a black field. Nobody ever made them change it. That's the bit I keep coming back to. There is a formal heraldic tradition in that world. There are heralds and maesters and centuries of precedent, and at some point somebody looked at a banner depicting a skinned human being and went, yes, fine, register that. The Boltons ruled the north, out of the Dreadfort, long before the Starks unified it, and the two families spent centuries at war. The stories from that period say the Red Kings of the Dreadfort flayed Starks who displeased them and wore their skins as cloaks. That's from the older written histories, rather than the show, so take it as legend if you like, but the Boltons themselves have never been in any hurry to deny it. The flaying was formally outlawed when they finally bent the knee. They kept the banner. Now everyone remembers Ramsay. I want to talk about Roose first because Roose is the genuinely frightening one, and I don't think that's a hot take so much as an underappreciated fact. Roose Bolton is quiet. He speaks softly enough that people lean in. He has himself leeched regularly because he believes it keeps his blood calm, and he says that a peaceful land needs a peaceful lord. He is polite to absolutely everybody, including people he is about to have killed. There's a scene in the show that tells you everything. Theon has been taken, tortured, mutilated and broken, and Roose finds out about it. He's furious, genuinely angry in his flat little way. Not about the torture, about the waste. Theon was Balon Greyjoy's last living son, and therefore worth an entire fortress in a trade, and Ramsay has ruined the merchandise. Later on, when Ramsay flays Lord Serwyn and his family over unpaid taxes, Roose tells him off again, and the argument he makes is a management argument. Terror can't hold the north. The other houses outnumber us. If they rise together, we lose. That's the whole man. He isn't restraining his son on moral grounds. He's restraining him on the ground that it's inefficient, which is the same objection a good accountant would have. That's the second time in this video we've run into somebody whose scariest quality is that they're a competent administrator, and we'll hit a third shortly. Ramsay is the other kind. Ramsay is appetite with no ceiling on it. The Hunt is the clearest picture of him. He takes a peasant girl out into the woods around the Dreadfort with his dogs, and his companion Myranda and Theon in tow, and he chases her down for sport. When she's caught, the dogs tear her apart. His reasoning, offered casually, is that she'd got above herself. Theon, who at that point is already thoroughly broken, watches it and can't do anything. What Ramsay does to Theon over the course of a year is systematic rather than impulsive, which is what makes it so unpleasant to sit through. He doesn't just hurt him, he rescues him repeatedly from men who turn out to be his own men. He gives him hope and then takes it. He removes pieces of him. He gives him a new name, Reek, because he stinks, and keeps beating him until Theon says the name himself. Theon holds out and eventually says it, and that's the moment Ramsay's actually after, not the pain, the agreement. He sends the worst of it to Pike in a box with a note. The end of the Boltons is the one piece of narrative satisfaction in this entire section. Rose gets a knife from his own son the moment a legitimate Bolton heir is born. Ramsay loses Winterfell at the Battle of the Bastards, mostly through arrogance, and finishes up tied to a chair in his own kennels with dogs he's deliberately starved for a week. Sansa walks away while it happens and allows herself a small smile. I understand why the show did it that way. The audience had spent 3 seasons wanting it, and giving it to them exactly with the dogs is a very clean bit of storytelling. But I do find it worth noticing what's actually being offered there. It's the Bolton method performed correctly by the person they wronged. The show frames it as an ending. It's arguably a continuation. Sansa learned something at Winterfell, and what she learned wasn't mercy. And the Boltons only ever got the North in the first place because of what happened at a wedding. The other half of the Bolton legacy is what happened to the North while they held it, and it's not a story the show has much time for. Roose was named Warden of the North by a Lannister government that had no intention of leaving him there permanently. Tywin's plan, stated out loud, was to hand the North to a future Lannister grandchild, once Sansa had produced one. So Roose spent his brief tenure ruling a province where every single house hated him, on behalf of a family who were already planning to replace him, with an heir he couldn't control. He knew all of it, he says as much, and he did it anyway, because the alternative was staying a bannerman, and Roose Bolton had been quietly waiting for the Starks to stumble for a very long time. A last word on Ramsay, and then I'll leave him alone. The most instructive thing about him is that he was a bastard, legitimised late, and never quite secure in it, and everything he does can be read as a man terrified of being nobody. He collects titles obsessively. He signs his letters with the name he was given rather than the one he was born with. He kills his father and his stepmother and his newborn half-brother within about a minute of that brother existing, because a true-born Bolton son makes him a Snow again. That doesn't excuse a single thing, but it does explain why the cruelty escalates rather than plateaus. He's not enjoying a stable position, he's constantly proving one. Guest right starts as table manners. The custom is simple. If you enter a man's home and eat his bread and salt at his table, you are his guest and you are under his protection for as long as you remain under his roof. It runs both ways. He can't harm you, and you can't harm him. The gods are supposed to enforce it. What's remarkable is that this is the one law in Westeros that people are actually afraid of. Not the king's law, not the faith. Men in that world break oaths of fealty over lunch. They murder cousins, they betray kings, they perjure themselves in front of a septon without blinking. But bread and salt makes hardened, cynical, thoroughly awful people go quiet. And the reason for that comes down to a story that northern children get told. The Rat Cook. There was a cook at the Night Fort, one of the abandoned castles on the wall, back in the days of the Andal kings. He had some grievance against a visiting king. The details vary depending on who's telling it. And he took his revenge by killing the king's son, baking him into a pie with bacon and onions and carrots, and serving it to the father, who ate 2 helpings and asked for more. The gods turned the cook into a giant white rat, cursed to eat nothing but its own young, and it's supposedly still up there in the ruins of the Night Fort. Here's the part of the story that matters, and Bran spells it out when he tells it. The gods didn't curse him for the murder. They didn't curse him for serving a man his own son. They cursed him because he killed a guest beneath his roof. That's the offence. Everything else was apparently within the acceptable range. Which brings us to the twins. Walder Frey did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not complicated. Robb Stark had broken a marriage pact with his house. The Lannisters were offering the Riverlands. Rose Bolton, who had been standing quietly at Robb's shoulder for 2 years, was offering the North in exchange for very little. So the Freys made a great show of hospitality. Bread and salt at the door, explicitly, in front of everyone. A wedding, a feast, musicians in the gallery. And then the musicians started playing The Rains of Castamere, which is not a wedding song. And Catelyn Stark understood roughly 2 bars before anybody else did. She'd already noticed that Rose Bolton was wearing mail under his clothes. What follows is a slaughter rather than a fight. Talisa first, and the child. The northern lords in the hall, and the northern soldiers in the camps outside, killed by men they'd been drinking with an hour earlier. Rose leans down over Robb and says, "The Lannisters send their regards," before putting the knife in, which is a genuinely great line and the coldest thing in the episode. And then the Freys sew the head of Robb's direwolf onto his body and parade it around the castle on a horse, chanting, "King in the North," while everybody laughs. The morning after is somehow the worst part, and it's the bit people talk about least. Servants are mopping blood off the floor of the Great Hall, and Walder Frey and Roose Bolton are sitting at breakfast, dividing the spoils. Frey gets River Run, Bolton gets Warden of the North. They're perfectly relaxed. Rose mentions with mild distaste that Robb was arrogant and wouldn't take advice. Walder wonders aloud how Winterfell ended up a ruin, and Rose explains that his bastard son has his own way of doing things. 2 men having a fry-up and a chat about staffing. The law got tested once more, further north and in the other direction. When the survivors of the Watcher's expedition took shelter at Craster's Keep, and we'll come back to Craster properly later, one of the brothers, Carl Tanner, killed his host at his own hearth. Lord Commander Mormont roared at him that the gods would curse a man who murders a host who took him in, and Carl shouted back that there are no gods beyond the wall. He was right about the geography. He was dead within the month regardless. As for the Freys, Arya eventually walked into that same great hall, carrying a pie. She'd already fed Walder, his sons. She watched him eat and then told him what he was eating, and the callback to the rat cook is entirely deliberate. Worth briefly mentioning the other famous wedding, since it's the same year and the opposite in every way. Joffrey's was killed by poison at his own feast, in front of hundreds, with his mother screaming and his uncle blamed. No broken oath there, no gods involved. Just a very careful woman with Sansa's poisoned hairnet and a great deal of patience. Weddings in that world have a truly appalling safety record, and I don't know why anyone still attends them. One small thing about the rat cook I can't leave alone. The story specifies that he served the pie with bacon and onions and carrots, and that the king found it so good he asked for a second helping. Whoever first told that story understood something about horror. It isn't the murder that makes you put your fork down. It's the seasoning. Somebody took care over it. Since we're on weddings, there's a small mercy buried in the Red Wedding, and it comes from Sandor Clegane of all people. The Hound had Arya outside in the camps, riding in to sell her back to her mother for a ransom, and he got there in time to see the Freymen killing Northerners around the fires. She went for the doors anyway. He knocked her out with the flat of an axe and carried her away over the saddle, holding up a Frey banner so nobody stopped them. The most feared killer in the Riverlands, who joined the story burning children's toys and threatening a butcher's boy, quietly performing the only act of protection anybody manages that night. The show never makes a moment of it. It just happens in the corner of the frame. Since we've just heard it played, let's talk about the song. The Rains of Castamere is everywhere in that world. It's in taverns and camps and at feasts. Bronn hums it. Cersei has it played at a wedding. Everybody knows the tune, and hardly anyone in the audience gets told what it's about, which I think is deliberate on the show's part, because in-world it's the same. It's a song that works precisely because you don't have to explain it. The story behind it goes back to Tywin's father. Lord Tytos Lannister was by every account an extremely nice man and a catastrophic lord. He laughed off insults, he lent money he never got back, he forgave debts, forgave slights, and generally responded to being taken advantage of by being pleasant about it. His bannermen stopped fearing him, and then stopped respecting him, and then stopped bothering to hide it. Two houses in particular, the Reynes of Castamere and the Tarbecks of Tarbeck Hall, grew rich and loud, and openly mocked the Lannisters to their faces. Tywin was a young man watching all this, and his conclusion, which is the key to the entire character, was that the family's problem was not military or financial. It was reputational. People had stopped being afraid, and everything else followed from that. So when the Reynes and Tarbecks rebelled, he answered it in a way designed to be talked about for centuries. Tarbeck Hall was pulled down on top of its occupants, and at Castamere, the Reynes retreated into their own mine workings beneath the castle, which were extensive and defensible, and which they'd been getting rich from for generations. Tywin sealed the entrances and let the water in. They drowned in the dark. In tunnels they dug themselves. The mines were never reopened. Both houses ended entirely, root and branch, and Castamere sits empty to this day. That's the source material. Some singer turned it into a ballad, and Tywin, who understood exactly what he had, made sure it got played. Because a song does the work an army can't. An army has to march to your problem. A song is already in the room before you arrive. I'll flag that the detail of the flooded mines comes from the deeper written histories rather than the show. The show references Castamere constantly and tells you the outcome without walking you through the plumbing. But it's such a Tywin solution that it hardly matters which version you carry. What he was like in practice, nearly 40 years later, you can see at Harrenhal. When the Lannister army occupied the castle, the garrison under Gregor Clegane spent their time torturing the local peasants who'd been rounded up. There was a man they called the Tickler who ran it, and he had a method. A rat in a metal bucket, the bucket strapped to a man's stomach, a fire held to the back of the bucket. The rat does the obvious thing. The prisoners were refugees, they were farmers who'd run from the fighting. They didn't know anything about hidden gold or the Brotherhood or anything else, because there was nothing to know. Then Tywin arrived with the main host and stopped it immediately. And again, not on the grounds you'd like. He stopped it because the amount of wealth you could extract from a starving Riverlands peasant was trivially small compared to the value of that peasant doing useful work around the castle. It was, in his words, a poor use of resources. Which is the third time in this video that a man has walked into a torture chamber and objected to the paperwork. He also spotted within about 4 seconds that the boy pouring his wine was a girl in disguise and told his own soldiers off for being too stupid to notice. That's Tywin all over, constantly, quietly appalled by the mediocrity of everyone around him. Then when he withdrew from Harrenhal, he had 200 Northern and Riverlands prisoners killed and left in the courtyard, because taking them would have slowed him down. And Gregor Clegane, who is the instrument Tywin points at things, has his own file. He was the one who went into the Red Keep during the sack, killed Rhaegar's infant son, and then did what he did to Alia Martell of Dorne, with her daughter's blood still on him. Robert Baratheon called those bodies dragon spawn, and considered the matter closed. Dorne did not consider the matter closed, and spent the next 20 years not considering it closed, which is a thread that runs quietly under an enormous amount of what happens later. The thing about Tywin that I find most unsettling is that he never once loses his temper. He only rarely loses his temper in the whole run of the show. Every terrible thing he does is calm, considered, and defensible on a spreadsheet. He isn't cruel for pleasure. He's cruel because he did the sums, and cruelty came out cheaper. A quick note on the song's afterlife, because it's a genuinely clever piece of world building. The Rains of Castamere doesn't function as a warning to the people who hear it in taverns. Most of them have no idea what it's about. It functions on the people who do know, the lords, the bannermen, the men who might otherwise start thinking about their options. They hear it played at a feast, and they remember, without anyone saying anything, what happened to the last 2 houses who got ideas. That's the point. Tywin didn't need the song to be popular. He needed it to be unavoidable at exactly the tables where treason gets discussed. And in the end, the tune became so ordinary that when it started up in the hall at the Twins, half the room heard nothing but a familiar bit of music, and Catelyn Stark heard a death sentence. One more Lannister detail, since it undercuts everything else in this section rather nicely. Tywin won the war and bankrupted the crown doing it. The gold mines at Casterly Rock, the source of the family's entire reputation, had actually run dry years before, and he'd kept that quiet while continuing to spend, as though they hadn't. By the time the fighting stopped, the crown owed the Iron Bank of Braavos an amount of money nobody could realistically repay. So the most feared man in Westeros spent his last years running an enormous confidence trick, and everyone he'd terrified into obedience was being held in line by wealth that no longer existed. There's something very satisfying about that, and I don't think it's entirely accidental on the author's part. The sack of King's Landing happened because a king had stopped being reachable, which means we need to talk about Wildfire and about the Alchemists' Guild, who are one of my favourite bits of background furniture in the whole setting. Wildfire is a green liquid, roughly the consistency of thick oil, and it burns. That undersells it. It burns at a temperature that melts stone and steel. It burns on water, it burns underwater, and once it's going, you cannot put it out with anything. Sand smothers it if you pile enough on. Nothing else does. Water spreads it. It's made by the Alchemists' Guild, who are a genuinely powerful institution back when there was still real sorcery about, and who have since become a slightly sad club of old men in robes calling each other wisdom. They guard the recipe, absolutely. The substance also gets more unstable the longer it sits, which is a wonderful quality in a product stored in clay pots in a cellar. And Aerys II loved it. He didn't start that way. Young Aerys was charming, generous, ambitious, and reasonably well liked. The decline was slow, and it had a specific accelerant. Along the way, there were signs. He had Sir Ilyn Payne's tongue torn out with hot pincers in public, because Payne was overheard saying that Tywin Lannister was the man actually running the realm. The infuriating part being that this was completely true, and everybody knew it. Then came the defiance of Duskendale. Lord Darklyn refused to pay his taxes, and when Aerys rode down personally to sort it out, took the king prisoner. Aerys spent 6 months in a cell in Duskendale, while the realm tried to work out what to do. Tywin's approach was to threaten to level the town. Sir Barristan Selmy eventually got in over the walls and got him out. He was never the same afterwards. The histories more or less agree that whatever was left of his mind broke in that cell. The Darklings were executed for it, the whole house. After Duskendale, he stopped appearing in public. He wouldn't allow a blade anywhere near him, not a razor, not a knife at table, nothing but the swords of his own Kingsguard. So his hair grew down past his waist, matted and filthy, and his fingernails grew several inches long and curled. And the Iron Throne, which is made of 1,000 melted swords, and is notoriously badly finished, cut him constantly. He was covered in scabs from the seat he refused to leave. They called him the King of Scabs behind his hand. The burnings became the court's regular business, which brings us to Rickard and Brandon Stark. Brandon rode to King's Landing to demand justice for his sister. Aerys arrested him and summoned his father Rickard to answer for it. Rickard demanded trial by combat, as was his right, and Aerys agreed and named fire as his champion, which is the sort of thing that sounds like sophistry until you're hanging over a fire pit in your own armour, cooking inside it. And Brandon was put in front of him, with a strangling device around his neck, and a long sword laid on the floor, just out of reach. So the harder he strained towards the sword to save his father, the tighter the cord pulled. He killed himself trying to reach it, while the king laughed. That's what started Robert's rebellion. It isn't really about an abducted girl at all when you look at the sequence. It's about a king murdering a lord of Winterfell and his heir in the throne room for the crime of asking a question. Then, at the end of the war, with the rebels at the gates and Tywin's army already inside the city, having been let in on the promise of loyalty, Aerys gave the order he'd apparently been building towards for years. The pyromancers had been busy. There were caches of wildfire buried all over King's Landing, under the Sept of Baelor, under the Guildhall of the Alchemists, under Flea Bottom, under the stables, under houses full of ordinary people who had no idea, under the Red Keep itself. Burn them all of it, the whole city and everyone in it, 500,000 people, on the grounds that if he couldn't hold King's Landing, then nobody would, and that he would rise from the ashes as a dragon. Jaime Lannister was 17 years old, and standing behind him, he had sworn a vow to protect the king. He had also, that morning, been listening to a mad old man plan to burn every person he'd ever known. He killed the pyromancer, and then he killed the king, and then he sat down on the throne to wait, and everybody who walked in afterwards decided he'd done it for his father and his own advancement. He carried the name Kingslayer for the rest of his life, and for most of that time did not bother explaining himself, which is either enormous pride or enormous exhaustion, and I've never quite decided one loose end. Those caches were never all recovered. Some were dug up over the years. Nobody ever produced a full inventory, because the men who buried them were dead, and the substance only gets less stable with age. That's a great deal of very old wildfire sitting under a city with no map. Something about wildfire I find quietly grim is what it did to the men who make it. The pyromancers spent centuries as a minor curiosity, a guild with a dwindling membership and a product nobody much wanted. Then a mad king took an interest, and suddenly they had the run of the city and unlimited funding, and they went at it enthusiastically. Wisdom Halline, the one we meet, is almost giddy about it. He talks about the substance the way a proud craftsman talks about anything, and he seems entirely untroubled by what it's for. That's a pattern worth noticing. Nobody in this story ever has to look far for a specialist willing to do the technical work, provided somebody with money asks nicely. It's easy to forget that Aerys was, technically, married to his own sister. Rhaella Targaryen was his sibling and his queen, and by the end of his reign, the marriage was a horror that the court simply worked around. The Kingsguard stood outside her door on the nights he came to her, listening, forbidden to intervene, because their vows bound them to the king, and not to the woman screaming on the other side of the wood. Jaime Lannister was one of the men standing in that corridor at 17. When people ask why he killed Aerys, everyone reaches for the wildfire, which is the dramatic answer. There was quite a lot else already in the account by then. Aerys wasn't the first Targaryen the family would rather nobody wrote about. There's a line that gets quoted constantly, that every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin, and the realm holds its breath. It's a great line. It's also, I'd argue, a bit of a con. Most of the bad Targaryens weren't mad in any clinical sense. They were just people with dragons, and no one able to say no to them, which produces very similar results, without needing any madness at all. Take Maegor. Maegor the Cruel earned the name during a 6-year reign, which is not a lot of time to earn a name like that. His main fight was with the Faith. His father, Aegon the Conqueror, had come to an arrangement with the Faith of the Seven that let the Targaryens keep marrying their siblings without anybody making a fuss. Maegor pushed it far past what the arrangement could bear, taking multiple wives at once, and the Faith raised an army, the Faith Militant, and the resulting war ran for years. His methods included flying a dragon over a sept full of people. He held a trial of 7 where 7 of the faith's champions fought 7 of his, to settle it by combat, and it went so badly for everyone involved that he came out of it barely alive and unconscious for several weeks. And then there's the Red Keep. Margor finished the castle his father started, and he had it riddled with secret passages and hidden doors, which is why anyone who knows the building can move through it unseen. When it was finished, he had the workmen killed. All of them. Masons, carpenters, labourers, so that nobody living knew the layout but him. He was found dead on the Iron Throne one morning, sat upright with the blades of it through his wrists and neck. Nobody has ever established whether that was murder or the throne finally getting bored of him. Then considerably later, Aegon IV, who is held by the Maesters to be the worst king in the history of Westeros, and given the competition, that's a title. He wasn't a monster in the Maegor sense. He was a glutton and a petty man, and he ran the realm as a personal indulgence. 9 mistresses in succession, all installed at court, all paraded in front of his sister wife Nyerys, who by every account loathed the entire arrangement. He disliked his own son and heir Daeron for being bookish, for marrying a Dornish princess, and for preferring peace. So he gave Blackfire, the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of Aegon the Conqueror, the physical symbol of the dynasty, to his bastard son, Daemon, instead. Because Daemon was more martial and, he felt, more worthy of it. And then on his deathbed, in a final act of what I can only describe as spite dressed as generosity, he legitimised every bastard he had ever fathered. All of them, at once. The result was the Blackfire Rebellion. Daemon took the sword's name for his new house, claimed his half-brother was illegitimate, and half the realm declared for him. Tens of thousands died. It came to a head at the Battle of Redgrass Field, one of the largest battles ever fought in Westeros, where Daemon was killed by a volley of arrows from his own half-brother Bloodraven, who then fought his other half-brother Bittersteel in single combat in the middle of the field. 3 of Aegon IV's bastard sons on that one field killing each other, and Bittersteel escaped with Daemon's surviving boys and took them across the sea, which meant the whole thing rumbled on for generations afterwards. A war that lasted a century, caused by one man being annoyed that his son liked books. Then there's Aerion Brightflame, who I mention purely for the manner of his exit. Aerion was a Targaryen prince with a nasty streak and an obsession with dragons. Believing that fire would transform him, he drank a cup of wildfire. It did not transform him. And then Summerhall. Summerhall was a Targaryen pleasure palace in the Stormlands. In the year 259, King Aegon V, a genuinely decent king, one of the better ones, who spent his reign trying to improve the lives of the small folk against the constant resistance of his own lords, attempted something there. He wanted dragons back. There had been no living dragons for well over a century. Nobody knows what the attempt involved. Eggs, certainly. Fire, certainly. Some kind of ritual, possibly wildfire. Possibly a wood witch, possibly a prophecy. The accounts are useless, and they're useless on purpose. Whatever it was, it went wrong. The palace burned. The king died in it. His son and heir Duncan died in it. And Sir Duncan the Tall, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, died in the fire. And on that same night, in the fire, Rhaegar Targaryen was born. He grew up knowing that. He'd apparently go to the ruins of Summerhall on his own and sit there with a harp, playing music so sad it made people cry, which explains a fair amount about the man. The thing that fascinates me about Summerhall is how carefully the record was buried. Everything else in this world gets written down and argued about by maesters for centuries. Summerhall is a wall. Something happened, a king and an heir died, and the survivors clearly decided that the specifics were not going to be shared with anyone, ever. That's not an accident of history. That's a decision somebody made. A related thought on the Blackfires, since they end up mattering more than any of the participants intended. A rebellion that gets crushed properly ends. A rebellion whose leadership escapes over water does not. Bittersteel got Daemon's surviving sons across the narrow sea and founded a mercenary company in exile called the Golden Company, specifically to bring them back. And the Golden Company was still there generations later, still taking contracts, still nominally waiting for a Blackfire to sail west with. That's 5 separate Blackfire rebellions in total, spread across decades, all traceable to one deathbed decision by a bored king who wanted to annoy his son. It's a very long way for spite to travel. The way the family's own histories handled all this is telling, because they mostly didn't. The Targaryen line produced its share of decent rulers. Jaehaerys the Conciliator held the realm together for 55 years and is remembered as the best king they ever had. Daeron II brought dawn into the realm by marriage rather than fire, which nobody had managed in 2 centuries of trying. Aegon V spent his reign fighting for the small folk, but the histories the Maesters actually wrote lean hard on the disasters, partly because disasters make better chapters, and partly because the men writing them had their own opinions about kings with dragons, which loops us back to the same problem as always. There's no neutral account of any of it. There's only the Citadel's account, and the Citadel has never been especially fond of Targaryens. The family's worst episode isn't any single king though, it's the one where they turned on each other with dragons, and the important number from it isn't the human dead, it's that the dragons never came back. The setup briefly, because it's the least interesting part. King Viserys I named his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir and made his lords swear to it. Then he had sons by a second wife, Alicent Hightower. He never resolved the contradiction, and he died without resolving it, and both sides had perfectly reasonable grounds, and neither would move. That's it. That's the war. A succession nobody bothered to write down properly. What it produced was 2 years of Targaryens burning each other out of the sky. The moment the war stopped being recoverable came early, over Storm's End. Lucerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's teenage son, flew there on his young dragon Arax to deliver a message. Aemon Targaryen was already there on Vhagar, who was by then the oldest and largest living dragon in the world, and Lucerys's dragon was roughly the size of one of her legs. Aemon chased him. In the show, it's very clearly a chase that gets away from him. He wanted to frighten the boy, and then Vhagar decided for herself, because a dragon that size is not a horse, and does not stop because you've changed your mind. Arax and Lucerys came down in pieces over the sea, and Aemon's face when it happens is the face of a young man realising he has just started something. And what it started was blood and cheese. Daemon's answer was to send 2 men into the Red Keep, one a former gold cloak, one a rat catcher who knew the passages. The ones Maegor built, which is a nice bit of the castle's history coming back around. They found Queen Helena in her chambers with her 3 children, and they made her choose which of her sons would die. The show handles it about as carefully as it can. It's brief, and it is entirely without music. Helena points to one, and they take that one anyway, or near enough, and the boy Jaehaerys is killed and beheaded in front of his mother and his sister. Helena never recovers, not in the sense of grieving and moving on. She stops being a functioning person from that night, and everything she does afterwards has that under it. The whole dance is full of enormous set-piece dragon battles, and the thing that hollows out the greens permanently is 2 men and a decision made in a bedroom. Then there's Larys Strong, who is one of the quietly nastiest characters in either show, the clubfoot master of whisperers. He runs a network of agents whose tongues have been cut out so they cannot repeat what they see, and he uses it to know everything about everyone in the Red Keep. He burned his own father and brother, as we've already covered, and he tells Alicent about it afterwards, with the manner of a man expecting to be thanked. She's horrified. He assures her she'll reward him eventually. He's right. The other thing the war produced is the dragon seeds, and I think it's the most interesting political idea in House of the Dragon. The Blacks were short of dragon riders and had spare dragons, so they put out a call. Anyone with Targaryen blood, however that blood got there, could try to claim one. What turned up was a crowd of commoners from Driftmark and Dragonstone, several of whom were burned alive in the attempt, and 3 of whom succeeded. Hugh Hammer, a blacksmith, Ulf White, a drunk, Adam of Hull, a shipwright's lad. Overnight, 3 working men became the most militarily significant people alive, and Rhaenyra promised them knighthoods. You can watch the arithmetic happening behind their eyes. If a man with a dragon can be made a knight, a man with a dragon can be made anything he likes, and the only person who can stop him is another man with a dragon. There's a scene at Dragonstone I keep thinking about, where Rhaenyra announces the plan to attack Lannisport and Old Town, and Hugh and Baelor both immediately flinch at what that actually means. Thousands of people in cities who have no part in any of this. Rhaenyra flinches too. Jacaerys makes the argument that far more will die if the war drags on, which is the argument that has been made before every atrocity in recorded history, and is sometimes even true. Later she says it out loud to Mysaria. To take the throne she has to strike, and in striking she dooms thousands. She knows exactly what she's doing. That's not a defence, but it's not nothing either. The end of it is the storming of the Dragon Pit, and it's the single most consequential event in the world's history that isn't the Doom. King's Landing rose, not an army, the small folk, starving, sick of the war, whipped up by a preacher, and they went for the Dragon Pit, where several dragons were chained. Thousands of ordinary people, with spears and hands, and torches against dragons in an enclosed space. The dragons killed hundreds of them. The mob killed the dragons anyway. That's the whole story of the night, really. It turns out that the answer to a dragon is simply more people than the dragon can kill, and nobody had ever been desperate enough to try it before. By the end of the war, there were a handful of sickly dragons left, and within a generation, none at all. And the Targaryens spent the next century and a half as an ordinary royal family who happened to have very memorable hair. Rhaenyra's own end came before that. Her half-brother Aegon fed her to his dragon Sunfire in front of her son, and then had the boy watch. She'd been queen for a matter of months. One more thread from the dance, and it's the one with the longest reach. When the war ended, the crown was left with a boy king, a shattered treasury, and a very clear institutional memory of what had just happened. Dragons had burned the realm's own cities. Dragons had killed most of the royal family, and in the decades that followed, the remaining dragons kept in the Dragon Pit got smaller and sicklier with each generation, until the last one was a stunted, deformed thing the size of a dog. There's a persistent suggestion in the histories that this wasn't only grief and bad luck, that keeping dragons chained in a stone building stunts them, and that somebody at court understood this perfectly well. Nobody ever wrote down an order. They simply built a roof and kept the doors shut, and about 100 years later, the last dragon died of it. Whether that's a conspiracy or just a very slow accident, the result is the same. The most powerful weapon in the world went out quietly, in a shed, because nobody who benefited from it wanted it back badly enough to open a door. And a word for Alicent, because she gets flattened in most retellings. She isn't a schemer by temperament. She's a girl who was put in a room with a grieving king by her father at 14, and told to be comforting, and who then spent 30 years building a fortress of duty and propriety around that fact, because the alternative was admitting what had been done to her. Her cruelty, when it comes, is the cruelty of somebody enforcing rules she never got to break herself. The scene where she comes to Dragonstone at night, alone, and offers Rhaenyra the city in exchange for her children's lives is the whole character In one conversation, she admits her faults, she does not ask for anything, and she's not told reasonably that it isn't enough. The throne survived all that. The city, underneath it, is a different conversation, and the honest way in is the smell. King's Landing stinks. This isn't a passing joke, it's the first thing anybody says about the place. It went up fast, without planning, on ground that wasn't chosen for anything except that Aegon happened to camp there, and it's been growing ever since, without anybody solving drainage. Tyrion describes the smell in detail. Visitors comment on it from miles out. At the bottom of it is Flea Bottom. The famous thing about Flea Bottom is the food. There are pot shops on every corner, selling a bowl of brown, which is a stew that has been going in the same pot for years. Things get added, nothing gets taken out. The joke, which is only sort of a joke, is that you can find anything in a bowl of brown, and the reason nobody looks too closely is that there are more stray dogs in that district than anywhere else in the city, and the two facts do seem related. Gendry grew up there. So did Davos Seaworth, more or less, in the equivalent slum at Flea Bottom's cousin. Davos's line about it, that the first thing he remembered was hunger, sits under his whole character. Above that, you've got the Red Keep, and beneath the Red Keep, the Black Cells. The Black Cells are the bottom level of the dungeons. No light, not dim light, none. Food is pushed through a slot in the door by somebody who doesn't speak. Ned Stark spent time down there and lost track of days entirely. The design intent is fairly clearly to remove a person from time. Then there's the business with Robert's bastards. Robert Baratheon fathered children everywhere, cheerfully and without much thought, and after his death, somebody worked out that those children were a problem, because a room full of black-haired Baratheon bastards raises awkward questions about the golden-haired children on the throne. So the gold cloaks went out, door to door across the city in one night. Bara was the youngest. Robert had been with her mother at Chataya's brothel, and the girl was a few weeks old, and Janos Slynt came in and did it in front of the mother. The show doesn't dwell on it, but it puts it in, and that scene is the point at which the story stops pretending the political game is being played by adults with limits. Joffrey, then. And I'll be brief because the show already does the lingering, and there's not much I can add. Joffrey isn't interesting as a person, he's interesting as a demonstration. He's what you get when someone with total power has no upstream check on him whatsoever. No father who cares, a mother who indulges, a Kingsguard sworn to obey, and a council too busy to intervene. He orders Ser Dontos to drink himself to death for sport. He shoots people with a crossbow because the crossbow is there. He does what he does to Ross because nobody has ever told him no in a way that stuck. Every cruel thing he does is small-minded and childish, which is exactly the point. He isn't a great villain. He's a spoiled boy with a state apparatus. The city itself broke properly during the riot. The population had roughly doubled with refugees running from the fighting in the Riverlands. There wasn't food. There wasn't housing. Nobody had planned for any of it, because planning for it would have cost money the Crown had already spent. And then the royal party rode through the middle of it on the way back from the docks, in silks, having just shipped Myrcella off to Dorne. Somebody threw dung at Joffrey. Joffrey ordered the crowd killed. And the crowd, which outnumbered the guards by an enormous margin, simply took the street. The High Septon was pulled off his horse and torn apart by hand. Lolly's Stokeworth was dragged into an alley. The Hound went back in for Sansa. It's about 90 seconds of screen time, and it's the clearest look the show gives you at what's actually holding King's Landing together, which is not much. And in the Red Keep, through all of it, Qyburn. Qyburn was thrown out of the citadel and stripped of his chain, which is a rare thing. The Maesters tolerate a lot. What they wouldn't tolerate was experimenting on living people. Cersei found him working as a field surgeon, gave him a laboratory, a title, and eventually the enormous dying body of Gregor Clegane, and told him to see what he could do. What he produced doesn't speak and doesn't remove its helmet and can't reasonably be called alive. Then there's the end. We mentioned the caches, and I won't go over the ground again. Cersei put them to their intended use under the Great Sept of Baelor, and got in one morning what a mad king never managed: the Faith, the Tyrells, and every enemy she had in one building, gone in a green column visible across the whole city. She watched it from a window with a glass of wine, and when the city finally fell for good, the bells rang. That's the detail I always come back to. The bells ringing means surrender. The gates were open, the soldiers had dropped their swords, the siege was over, and everyone in King's Landing knew it, and so did everyone outside. It burned anyway. A closing thought on the keep itself, because it says something about the whole city. The Red Keep is a building designed by a paranoid man for a paranoid family, and it has worked exactly as intended ever since. There are passages behind the walls of every important room. Varys uses them. Littlefinger's people use them. A rat catcher used them once. Every single major turn in the story that happens inside that castle depends on somebody knowing a route that isn't on any map. Maegor killed a few hundred workmen to keep those routes secret, and the secret lasted about a fortnight, because secrets don't survive contact with servants. All he really achieved was making sure the people who did know were the ones with no reason to be loyal to the crown. There's a smaller detail from the sack of King's Landing that I think is the saddest thing in the city's history, and it involves a bell. When Tywin's army was let in, the gates were opened on his word that he'd come to defend the crown. The Lannister men rode through a city that had just been told the war was over and that help had arrived, and then they started killing. People came out into the streets to cheer them. It's the same trick, almost exactly, that gets played at the Twins a generation later. Somebody announces safety and the audience believes it, because the alternative is unbearable. That world runs on people wanting very badly for the worst thing to be finished. Right, north, and much older. The Night's Watch has a wonderful reputation and a recruitment problem, and the gap between those two things is where most of its troubles live. The vows are genuinely beautiful. The shield that guards the realms of men, the watcher on the walls, the fire that burns against the cold. Ned Stark's brother, Benjen, took the black. Men used to compete for the honour of it. In the very old days, it was a calling. By the time we meet it, it's a penal colony with a poem attached. The way it actually works is that a man who has committed a crime serious enough to hang gets offered the wall instead. Take the black, and everything you've done is wiped clean. So the recruiters ride south and tour the dungeons, and what they load into the carts and bring north is thieves, poachers, rapers, and boys who stole a wheel of cheese. Yoren, the recruiter we spend the most time with, is very matter-of-fact about it. He takes what he can get. The scale of the decline is easiest to see in the buildings. 19 castles were built along the wall. There are 3 still manned, 16 fortifications standing empty, including the Night Fort, which, as it happens, is where that cook was supposed to have done his baking. And of the men left, most are not fighters. They're stewards and builders. Sam, when he arrives, points out that he can't fight, can't ride, and can't hold a sword, and the answer he gets is essentially yes, and. Then there's Molestown, which is the village a short walk from Castle Black, and which exists for reasons that the vows have a great deal to say about, and the officers have agreed not to notice. Everyone knows, nobody writes it down. None of that, though, is the real problem with the Watch. The real problem is Craster. Craster is a wildling who lives alone in a fortified keep beyond the wall with 19 wives. All 19 of them are his own daughters. He has been doing this for a very long time, and the arrangement is that when a daughter grows up, she becomes a wife. And when a wife has a girl, the girl joins the queue. and when a wife has a boy, he takes it out into the woods and leaves it in the snow for the White Walkers. He calls himself a godly man for it. He says it out loud to Jeor Mormont's face, sitting by his own fire, that the Walkers are the real gods, that they'll come for everyone else and take whole armies, and that they'll leave him be because he pays, which, uncomfortably, appears to be true. He's the only man living unprotected north of the wall who has never had any trouble. Jon follows him out one night and sees the handover. Craster catches him and knocks him cold. And here's the part of this that I think is genuinely the darkest thing in the story. And it isn't Craster. Mormont already knew. Jon comes to him afterwards, bleeding, expecting outrage, and the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch tells him to leave it. He knows about the daughters, he knows about the sons, he's disgusted by it, personally, and he says so. And he does nothing, because Craster's keep is one of very few places beyond the wall where a ranging party can get out of the weather, and Craster is one of very few sources of information about what's happening up there, and he has sheltered a great many Black Brothers over the years, Benjen Stark among them. So the Watch has made a calculation. One monster is worth keeping because he's useful. Jon is expressly forbidden from interfering. That is an institutional decision, not a personal failing, and it's exactly the kind of decision that large organisations make constantly. It just happens to be visible here because the currency is babies. There's a smaller version of the same compromise in how the Watch handles Mance Rayder, incidentally. Mance was a brother of the Night's Watch himself before he walked away, and the official position on deserters is a sword through the neck, no exceptions, which is why Ned Stark opens the entire story, executing a terrified man who'd seen something in the woods. Then Mance builds an army, and the Watch spends years negotiating with him instead. The rule is absolute right up until the moment enforcing it would be inconvenient. What the Watch found out beyond the wall when it finally went looking was the fist of the first men. 300 men, most of the Order's officers and best fighters, camped on high ground, ambushed by White Walkers and their whites. A few dozen got out. Mance Rayder's people arrived afterwards and found the horses. Not the bodies, the horses. The severed parts arranged carefully on the ground in an enormous spiral laid out with care. Mance's comment is that they're always the artists, which is one of the more unsettling lines in the show, precisely because he says it so casually. The survivors fell back to Craster's, half-starved, and it fell apart there. Craster fed them bread made with sawdust and refused to open his stores. They called him a bastard. He came at them with an axe, and Carl Tanner put a dagger up through his jaw. Then Rast stabbed Mormont in the back while he was trying to stop it. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch killed at a table by his own men, and after that the keep became something considerably worse for the women left in it. Sam and Gilly got out through the back with her newborn, which is the only good thing to come out of that night. And then, walking south through the snow, Sam ran into a White Walker. Samwell Tarly, the boy who can't fight, can't ride, can't hold a sword. He'd picked up an odd black dagger at the fist because it looked interesting, and he stuck it into the thing more or less by accident, and it shattered like ice dropped on stone. First White Walker killed by a man in thousands of years, and the single most important tactical discovery of the entire war, that dragonglass ends them, was made by the worst soldier at the wall, on the run, in a panic, holding a knife he'd picked up because he thought it was neat. I love that. Out of everything in this world, that might be my favourite thing in it. And since we're on the subject of what Craster was feeding, let's finish up there. Start with the calendar, because the calendar is the first strange thing. The long night happened about 8,000 years ago. That figure is not a date. It's a guess made by people working from oral tradition and a few crumbling texts. And depending on which Meister you ask, the whole thing might have been considerably more recent. The first men didn't write. The children of the forest didn't write either. What survives is a story that got told for a few hundred generations before anybody thought to put it on paper, which is roughly the reliability of a rumour passed down a very long queue. The story says a winter came that lasted a generation. Not a hard season, years of darkness. Crops failed everywhere. Then there were no crops, and the accounts get quite ugly about what people did to survive it. And through that dark came the others, killing everything living and raising it again afterwards to keep killing. They were stopped eventually at the battle for the dawn, and the wall went up behind them, and the Night's Watch was founded to hold it. That's the version everybody in Westeros grew up with. What the show adds in about 40 seconds of screen time is where they came from. The children of the forest made them. The children were the original inhabitants, small, ancient, tied to the weirwoods, and losing badly to the first men who'd come across the land bridge with bronze and axes and a habit of cutting down sacred trees. So they took a man, bound him to a weirwood, and drove a shard of dragonglass into his chest. Leaf's explanation, when Bran asks her why, is one line: "We were at war. We were being slaughtered." Leaf says, "Our sacred trees were being cut down. They built a weapon, and the weapon got away from them," which is the oldest story there is, and it's slightly startling to find it sitting at the bottom of this particular mythology. Everything that follows, the long night, the wall, all those centuries of men freezing on a rampart, the whole apparatus, exists because a desperate people made something they couldn't control, and then had to make peace with the enemy they'd been fighting in order to survive their own invention. The children and the first men eventually signed the pact on the Isle of Faces in the middle of the God's Eye, which is the same lake Harren later built his castle beside. The children carved faces into the weirwoods to witness it. Those faces are still watching, in Godswoods, all over the north, and the Starks pray in front of them without anybody quite explaining what's on the other side. There's an older legend attached to all this that the wall keeps to itself, and it's the Night's King. The story goes that the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch saw a woman on the ice, with skin white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. He gave her his seed and he gave her his soul, and he named himself king and ruled the Night Fort with her for 13 years, doing things that the histories firmly decline to describe. His name was struck from every record afterwards. That's from the old northern stories rather than the show, and old Nan tells it as a ghost story, which may be all it is. What's not a story is Hardhome. Thousands of free folk gathered in a bay, waiting to be shipped south, and the dead came over the hills. The part people remember isn't the fighting, it's the tidying up afterwards. Everybody on that beach standing back up when the Night King raises his arms. Which is the arithmetic problem in a nutshell. Every enemy you kill is a recruit. And then there's the last hearth, the Umber's seat, found abandoned by the army moving south. Little Lord Ned Umber, a boy pinned to the wall of his own hall, with his savoured limbs arranged around him in a spiral. The same spiral from the fist of the first men. Nobody ever explains it. Not once in the whole run. There are theories that it's a sign, a marker, a religious pattern, a message from the children's old carvings, and the show never confirms any of them. It just puts the pattern on the wall a couple of times, hundreds of miles and several seasons apart, and lets you notice. I've decided I prefer it that way. Some things in a story should stay unexplained, and something that has been walking around since before anyone was writing anything down, arranging body parts into shapes for reasons of its own, is considerably more effective without a footnote. The end came at Winterfell in the dark, in a battle that most people watched with the brightness turned right up. And it ended the way these things do in that world, which is quickly and awkwardly, and not at all in proportion to everything that came before it. A girl with a knife. The wall came down, the dead came through. They got as far as a courtyard in the north, and then it was over. The wall itself raises a question nobody in the story ever quite addresses. It's 700 feet of ice, 300 miles long, and the histories say Brandon the Builder raised it with the help of giants, and possibly the children. There are spells worked into it, supposedly. That's why the dead can't cross while it stands. Nobody has ever been able to test that theory, and nobody has been able to explain how it's maintained either. It doesn't melt. It doesn't carve. Men walk on top of it with picks and shovels and pretend that's what's holding it up. And the Night's Watch, a few hundred criminals and second sons, spent all that time manning a piece of infrastructure they had no idea how to build, no idea how to repair, and only a vague folk memory of why it was there. They kept doing it anyway, for 80 centuries out of habit, long after everyone south of the neck had decided the whole thing was a story. I find that genuinely quite moving in among everything else. And a note on the free folk, since they spend the whole story caught between the two things we've just discussed. Everything south of the wall calls them wildlings, which they find insulting. They call themselves the free folk, and the distinction matters enormously to them. They don't kneel, they don't inherit, they choose their leaders, and Mance Rayder united roughly 90 separate clans speaking 7 languages, which is a feat of politics that nobody in the south ever gives him credit for. And the reason they were coming south was not conquest. It was that the dead were behind them, and there was a wall in front of them, and the men on the wall were pointing arrows at the only door. All that history, and the argument at the end of it was about whether people fleeing something worse should be allowed through a gate. The strangest thing about the others is how little anybody ever learns about them. They don't negotiate. They don't explain. In the entire written record, nobody logs a single word from one of them, in any language, to anybody. Craster deals with them, and even he doesn't seem to have had a conversation. He leaves things out, and they take them, the way you'd leave milk for something in a hedge. Whatever the children made, it stopped being a person a very long time ago. And the story never tells you what it wanted, or whether wanting is the right word for it at all. One final aside, since it's my favourite bit of Citadel trivia, and it belongs with everything we've talked about tonight. A Maester earns a link in his chain for every subject he masters. Iron for warcraft, gold for economics, silver for medicine, black iron for ravenry, and Valyrian steel for the higher mysteries. Magic, essentially. By the time the story begins, almost nobody bothers with the Valyrian steel link. Marwyn has one. Most Archmeisters regard the subject as a waste of a good student's time, which means the institution responsible for recording and interpreting the history of the world had collectively decided that the magical half of that history was nonsense, right up until the point where dragons hatched in Essos and the dead started walking in the north. They wrote the books everyone else reads. They set the curriculum, and they'd quietly filed the most important thing in the world under folklore. Here's the thing that strikes me, going back over all of it. Almost none of what I've just told you is settled fact inside that world. The Maesters argue about the long night. Nobody knows what happened at Summerhall or what caused the doom. The Boltons' skin cloaks might be slander. The Night's King might be a nursery story. Harrenhal's curse might just be a very large building with a very bad heating bill. The oldest histories in Westeros were written by the people who won, and they knew they were writing for posterity while they did it. Everything closer to the present is a bit more reliable, mostly in the sense that it stops including giants, but it's all still somebody's account. I think that's why the world holds up as well as it does. It isn't a setting with a Bible you can look things up in. It's a setting where the characters are guessing and arguing and repeating things their grandmother told them, and occasionally being completely wrong about their own past in ways that get people killed centuries later. There's a lot I didn't get to. The free cities have their own history, and Braavos alone could fill an evening, given it was founded by escaped slaves who kept its location secret for a century. Dawn is its own thing entirely, and the only kingdom that ever beat the dragons. The Citadel is quietly one of the strangest institutions in the whole world, and I have a lot of questions about what the Meisters are actually up to. I'd like to do all of those at some point, but that'll do for tonight. Thanks for listening. Sleep well.